Thanks for having me. My name's Lauren. I'm the founder of The Unseen and Material Alchemist. I thought I'd just take you through my journey and tell you a little bit about what's happened to me along the way and what I do. So the theme of my talk is really why I believe in magic. And as the talk theme is around home, I thought the best place to start would be at home. So I was born in Salford, but I grew up in a rural kind of Lancashire town full of hills and grass and nature, and we didn't have a computer, and it was kind of like, you know, back in the day, we would draw trees, not necessarily just Google them. And I spent all of my time playing in nature and getting stung by nettles and searching for dock leaves to fix them and making potions out of plants, and then in true entrepreneurial spirit trying to sell them to my mum and dad. So that's kind of where it began. And where I grew up was very close to Pendle, so the Pendle witches were sort of, you know, always a theme when Halloween came up. And I guess magic has always been close to my heart, and just something I've always been interested in, especially when looking at nature and learning from nature. My parents, so both my parents work in fashion, but before that, in their early career, they worked in engineering. My dad spent many years sat really meticulously drawing out plans and commercializing spirograph. I don't know if anybody remembers spirograph, but it was like this thing where you just drew. No Photoshop, no Illustrator, no technology. He would hand draw every tool that would go into producing the kits that hopefully as kids you got to play with. So again, engineering and science was always around me as I grew up. Later on in my dad's career, he gave up engineering and decided to start a fashion brand with my mum, where she ran the women's and he ran the men's. And I spent all of my kind of childhood to early teens in the back of a stock room, drawing on new marketing campaigns, dressing up and pretty much pretending I was a fashion designer. And I became obsessed with one particular designer, Alexander McQueen, because I just loved his creative storytelling and his imagery and all of the sort of new press reports that came through every season. I would be in the back on a Saturday when my parents were working, looking at all of this stuff. And I didn't realize at the time, but McQueen used a lot of technology and a lot of new innovations to tell his stories. So things like holograms, and this particular sort of hologram of his with Kate Moss always stuck into my mind. And at that point, I was like, right, this is what I want to do. I want to create, I want to work in fashion. But back to magic, my first interaction with magic as a kid was when I found a four-leaf clover. So as I said, I used to hunt in nature all the time, and I'm pretty persistent. And I found this four-leaf clover one day and like went running into the house and was like, oh my God, look, I found this 1 in a million magic four-leaf clover. And like took it to school for show and tell, and I was so proud of it. And everyone was like, you faked it, that's not real, you've just stuck another leaf on it. And I was so angry because I hadn't. I'd like spent hours and hours and hours as a kid like this, like trying to find a four-leaf clover, and then when I'd found one, no one believed me, and I was just so miffed off, basically. So I left home at 8, and I went off. And my dad loves telling the story because I sort of ventured off down the lane and packed my four-leaf clover in my money box, and that was it. I was like, I've had enough of you lot, I'm going. And he still says today, if you didn't follow me making werewolf noises and dragging me back, kicking and screaming, I don't think I'd ever come back. But 10 years later, at 18, I did leave and I went to university to study fashion. However, sort of 2 months into fashion course, I became incredibly ill and ended up having to take the year out and go into hospital. And I think any sort of 18-year-old, when they then are taken away from their dream and put into a hospital and in an incredible amount of pain, you're going to get pretty annoyed at the world and a pretty angry person. And I spent all of that kind of, that year being diagnosed with all sorts of different conditions, but essentially I was just in pain, and what it uncovered was that I'd actually fractured my spine. But I found it really hard to articulate my feelings and my pain levels to my doctors and also to my parents and my friends, and I was getting treated very much in a system where it was okay to say, what pain are you in, 1 to 10, and for me, I couldn't put a number to the amount of pain I was in, because how did I know that I wouldn't suffer more pain or less pain? So I just found it hard. So when I went back to university, I didn't want to just create fashion for fashion's sake anymore. I had a real chip on my shoulder, and I really wanted to answer some of the messages that as a person, or answer some of the feelings that I'd been having as a person, and try and communicate that back to somebody who, wasn't inside me. So I forced my way over to the chemistry department, because what else did I know? Well, I knew science. So I went over there and I said, look, I want to work together, I want to understand material, and I want to try and create something that allows me to visualize the pain that I've been having. I ended up working on a compound that didn't necessarily visualize my pain, but it visualized the Earth's pain. So it looked at carbon emission. And I ended up creating a molecule and a compound that absorbs air pollution. So it changes color from yellow to black to tell you how much air pollution you've absorbed each day. And I had this kind of like standoff moment where 4 years into going like this every day, similar to finding the four-leaf clover, I was making making various adjustments and very learn and tell, having had no science background, to create this compound. I realized that actually if I give you a book of facts and data and I tell you your carbon emission footprint, you're not really going to listen to it. But if I put you in this jacket and put you behind a bus and you visually see that, then you're going to have more of an emotional attachment to it and perhaps want to change the way that you live and work every day. So rather than go on to study a kind of PhD and carry on in that, to me it was all about this storytelling and the messaging and how I could get that into someone's hands and let them interact with it rather than it stay in research. So I went to the Royal College of Art to study textiles to really learn the creative side of the science and what should the compound be and what's the color and what's the message and how should the human interact with it. I graduated with a series of inks and also a series of garments which Kate Moss and Tim Walker actually shot together. This is one of them. And it was a series of feathers that changed color, and it was that kind of childhood dream again, although I was down these kind of crazy missions, the sort of, 11-year-old Lauren that was colouring Kate Moss in at 11 finally was dressing her, which was, an incredible moment. So I decided maybe I should set my own thing up because there wasn't anything that existed that worked in science and also worked in design. So I went on to set my own company up. And I was like, what shall I call it? So I took a step back, and I have a load of sketchbooks and blogs and stuff that I don't show anyone, that I keep for myself. And I took a step back one day, and I was like, oh, I'm not necessarily just interested in fashion and not necessarily interested in science. What I'm interested in is being curious about the world that I live in and myself and anything unseen. So I was like, I'm interested in pollution, I'm interested in data, I'm interested in DNA and building structures, in all of this kind of unseen stuff that I can't, as a human, understand. So I wanted to learn and to go on to understand that with the tools that I do know, which is science and design and material. So that's where it began. This was one of our first pieces which I worked on for Formula One. So it tracks aerodynamics and changes its color dependent on how much aerodynamic is around the car and also the human. But again, I wanted to keep it, science and technology to me shouldn't be plastic. It should be human, and it should be beautiful and also intricate, and I don't know, like I love handcraft, so I think all of these sculptures that I created were hand cut and hand formed and then impregnated with the dye to visualize this unseen matter. And without the material, the shape that it is influencing the compound, the two can't work. So it's sort of, everything has to be seamless. This was a piece that I worked on for Swarovski, which visualizes fluctuations within the brain. So it changes its color to let you know where in the brain is active. So if you've been to the gym and you have one patination, or if you've been, sad, or if you're depressed, or if you're anxious, you generate different pattern shifts across the brain, which are then picked up by the stones, which are all uniform, and then change their color to the sort of, different areas of the brain. It doesn't tell you what you're feeling, it doesn't tell you your emotion, but it tells you where is active. It's never going to be an MRI scan, and it wasn't about that. For me, it was about thinking about that pain messaging again, and how do you use art and design to communicate the most unseen thing around you. So if you had a broken arm, you would go to the doctors, but if you have a chemical imbalance or a broken brain, you probably just ignore it. So to me, I wanted to create something that helps you or somebody else understand what's going on inside. The next project was a little bit more from that. So whereas the Swarovski piece tells you where is active, this piece reads your EEG levels. So it changes color to the emotional patterns of the human. So depending on whether, again, you're anxious or sad. We did this as therapy sessions at Fashion Week, and everyone got red, which was anxious. But then the more kind of meditative you become and the more spiritual you become, the whiter the piece becomes. And that was a really interesting installation because it allowed people to see themselves in front of them for the first time in a kind of emotional pattern. And we collaborated with a couple of different universities on this to start to look at that data and look at how people respond to objects or themselves when they see them for the first time. This is another project, again, around the unseen, which I've just presented at the UN over in Washington, which is all around the world's health again, and how do you get kids back out to nature? Like, how do you get them off the Wii's and into the fields? Well, everyone must remember global hypercolor, and every time I present my work, someone goes global hypercolor, which is a heat-responsive t-shirt from when I was little in the 80s, but it's incredibly not sustainable. It's really bad for the environment. So I wanted to create something that was almost today's modern hypercolor. So this is a natural recipe that we made open source, which is derived from a cabbage, which is dyed into a cotton t-shirt, and then every time you wash that t-shirt in the water source of wherever you are, it will change to the pH of that water source to let you know how much carbon emission is in that environment. So, for example, this is pH neutral, which is purple. That's like the ideal color. This is London's color in the middle, Iceland's color on the side. And then we launched it as part of World Environment Day and asked children to go out, dye their own t-shirts and explore their world and start to make a map of the visual health of the world. So what's the Amazon's color? What's the Dead Sea's color? What's Manchester's? It's kind of like a game that, I'm trying to encourage young kids to go and explore in. We launched our own collections, so again, like that 11-year-old that was drawing in the back of the shop, then was presenting her collections at Selfridges. So this was our window at Selfridges, and my collection, a couple of pieces from my collection which currently sit between McQueen and Chanel. And the scarf, for example, monitors thermal regulation of the body and changes its color depending on where you wear it. The backpack is completely responsive to any city you take it to. It just does its own thing. But for me, it has to have deeper meaning. It's not just about creating a luxury fashion collection. So by creating this beautiful luxury silk scarf for Selfridges, in the same time I was working for the NHS and creating bandages that can detect things like wounds and tell you when they need changing. So by using high fashion to get the aesthetic and the luxuriousness, we then can create bandages at a much more human way. They feel much nicer, they interact in a much more human way. And I started to see the unseen for lots of other people. So, we work with all sorts of different brands and agencies and companies to visualize things like cars of the future. What color are they going to be when the car becomes autonomous driving? What does the relationship of the user driving it and the person on the street have when they are driving to color? It's not just a case of picking a color anymore. Like, can the color tell you if it's in speed mode, if it's in safety mode, who's driving it, etc. But it's not all plain sailing. So this was the first, what I presented there was the first 2-3 years of my company, which really, when we think about it, was my passion and my dream, which then became a business. And it became really tough, and we lost a project, and I had to make friends redundant that I'd employed. I had to sort of sacrifice a lot of things, and I was very much ready to give it up this time last year, and my team went from 6 to 1, and I just didn't want to do it anymore. I'm going to be truthful and admit that. But it was my roots and my family, again, that rallied around me, and my dad, who constantly tells me the story of this kid that goes, this is a text he sent me, which was, that the fear of failure is good, and just remember that kid that always went down that path and must have been scared, but still did it anyway, and still went on into the unseen. So I thought, I wasn't really a functioning adult at this time last year. I was functioning on very bare minimum. So I just did what I could do, which was create. And me and my best friend were watching a film from our childhood called The Craft last year, which is a film where the witch changed the color of her hair like this, and I have pretty long hair, so I'd known from my projects and my hair dipping in some of my inks that constantly, if anybody sees me outside today, my hair and my hands always change color dependent on the temperature of the environment by accident. So I knew I could do it, and I just thought, why, if I can do it, why should I not do it? I mean, color change hair isn't going to change the world, but little did I know, I launched it, and overnight it got 38 million views, and 60 million views later, it's since become the biggest project the Unseen has ever had, and my team went from 1 to 10, and is growing every day. So I think, for me, I had to go back to Magick and back to my roots to be able to remember what I do, and although it's important to create things with meaning and with deeper world-changing problems, it's also important to have fun with what you do and not let it become just a career. The whole point of my talk, which was around why I believe in magic, is that, well, one, we should believe in fairy tales. I've been told many times not to believe in fairy tales, but if I didn't, I wouldn't be stood here today, and I wouldn't have the interesting things that I get to do every day. And really, at the bare minimal, magic is just science that we don't understand yet. So that's it.